Let's turn our attention to the BBC. And once again, the BBC in the firing line for, well, frankly, quite rightly, being accused of downplaying terrorism by Hamas and basically treating Israel as if it's a militaristic and aggressive nation, as opposed to the victim of one of the worst terror attacks the world's seen. Let's talk about this with Jake Wallis-Simons. He's editor of the Jewish Chronicle. He's also author of the brilliant book Israel-Phobia, the newest version of the oldest hatred and what to do about it. And Jake, you join us today after just returning from Gaza, where you have been able to travel into Gaza with the Israeli Defense Forces to see what's happening for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, when you see the conflict on the ground, it's really apparent that the Israeli troops are taking every measure possible to protect civilian life. Indeed, I was with a military delegation from around the world, the Western world, including General Sir John McCall, the former Deputy Supreme Commander of NATO in Europe. And he said to me that having observed IDF targeting practices, they were at least as robust as those used by the British Army.
Is it possible, though, that what the international observers were shown was a lovely, nice, prettified version, in the same way, you know, when the king walks through a housing estate, there's flowers and everything's been painted nicely, and you see a better version than what actually happens day to day?
Well, look, I suppose you have to match it with the facts on the ground, and the facts on the ground do bear out the impression that we got when we were shown into military command and control centres, met IDF commanders, and so forth. And the facts on the ground are that Hamas claim that 40,000 people have been killed, but that they don't separate between civilians and combatants. Even if you take those figures on face value, according to the IDF, up to 20,000 of those are Hamas fighters. Yeah. So if you look at those statistics, that means the IDF is killing at most one civilian for every combatant, which sounds like a lot, and it is, but it's way better than our record in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's way better than the record of the Americans, and indeed, it's better than the record of any modern army in any theatre of war around the world. And so it matches the facts with the impressions that we got.
And this is the key thing, isn't it? Is that no one with any heart or brain could think that any innocent civilian dying in war is okay. Certainly not innocent children. The key thing here is why Israel is being held repeatedly to a much higher standard than we hold our own government, and certainly how we hold pretty much any other government around the world. And this is where this BBC report comes in. Now, this is a team of some 20 lawyers, some 20 data scientists working with the leader of this research, British lawyer Trevor Assison, and they're looking into basically the corporation's coverage, the BBC's coverage of Israel and Hamas since October the 7th and onwards for 4 months. And they basically looked at basically the ratio of they call it the sympathy ratio of the coverage in terms of when it was more sympathetic to Israel or when it was more sympathetic to Hamas. And again, I'm saying Hamas, not the Palestinians, to Hamas, quite specifically a terror organisation. Of course, the BBC refuses to use the term terrorist organisation about Hamas, but basically found that the Jewish state faces basically being delegitimized in terms of its decision to prosecute a war. It's seen as the aggressor. When Hamas said something about an attack or the number of deaths, it is treated almost as gospel. When Israel says something, it is treated questionably. I mean, you'd only have to watch the BBC for a day to spot this, wouldn't you, Jake?
Yeah, I mean, and as I was just about to say earlier, you know, if Israel faces an opposition that intentionally places its civilians in harm's way, and it still manages to achieve the record that I've talked about before. Imagine if it was a normal foe, you know, and yet these people are the ones that seem to hold most weight with BBC reporters a lot of the time. These jihadi maniacs who, who rape, kill and mutilate as much as they possibly can, then glory in it. I mean, looking at the statistics, some of those that were pulled out by the report, Israel was associated with genocide 283 times over the last 4 months, Hamas 19 times. Israel associated with war crimes 127 times, Hamas 30 times. Israel, I mean, it's almost funny, isn't it?
It is funny. It's just sort of, what are they seeing that we're not?
Exactly. Well, unfortunately, what they're seeing that we're not, they're showing to most of the country and the world via their huge audience in their international network. And one of those arms of broadcasting is BBC Arabic, which is much, much worse than the stuff that we see. Their Arabic language broadcasting. They've been using reporters who themselves have expressed support for Hamas on social media. In fact, 27% of their BBC commentators had expressed such support. One of them in particular, my favourite, the BBC Arabic reporter Maisar Abdul Khalek, he tweeted not just death to Israel, but he also tweeted, "Sir Hitler, rise, there are a few people that need to be burned."
It is just extraordinary, isn't it? And again, it's not just one wrong un who slipped through and no one realised they were in some secret group chat. We're talking about public statements on their Twitter feed, which also announced to the world that they are working, with the BBC, and there doesn't seem to be much of an issue with the BBC about this. Big criticism also of some of their very high-profile correspondents. I mean, Lise Doucette, Jeremy Bowen, for their reports. I have to say, in the mornings when I listen to a whole range of different broadcasters and watch a whole lot. I mean, I'm just sort of immutable, and I just find myself just shouting. I mean, just shouting at Radio 4 every morning because of just the abject nonsense and the way that the credence that is given always to anything that Hamas says, and the complete and utter disregard of anything Israel says, and there's the assumption always that Israel is the wrong one in this battle.
Yeah, it's really strange because Hamas have showed themselves on October the 7th to be very, very similar to Islamic State in terms of their appetite for brutality, for savagery, and for that sort of debased, depraved violence. And yet, if Islamic State was saying, 300 civilians have been killed yesterday in an attack on a school by the RAF, we would say, oh, come on. Yeah. I mean, we don't even believe the Russians when they make claims about civilian casualties because we know that they're run by Putin and that we don't trust them. And yet somehow, when it comes to Hamas, we're like, oh, OK, the freedom fighter guys, OK, we'll take...
But also, the number of times that they have been proven, it's not a, well, we're still not sure, that they have been categorically proven to have lied, or, the claimed missile attack on the hospital, the destruction of the hospital. The hospital is still there. I mean, stuff that they could absolutely prove was simply untrue. Plus, also, you've written a number of times on this, these very specific numbers of deaths that they give. I mean, very, very specific, to the last, the 47th person. They still don't know the death toll from the Iraq war in 2001. But apparently Hamas, tell you what, say what you like about Hamas, they're good at bureaucracy.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, Israel is good at fighting wars. Hamas is good at fighting the war of words, or propaganda war. And it's got a willing partner in the West. For whatever reason, international organisations, NGOs, international bodies like the UN and the international media have sympathy for Hamas. And I don't understand why. I've got my suspicions. Yeah,
well, I think we all have our suspicions. But this is one of the things, even in the peace talks, we're constantly told, Israel are refusing to agree to these terms of the peace talks. Then we find out, the US Secretary of State, who's been very happy to put pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu over the last 11 months on this issue, saying, actually, it's Hamas that didn't agree. I mean, Hamas... If people who are genuinely concerned about the deaths of civilians, you've pointed this out, there's enough tunnel network, every single Palestinian child, one woman and child could be inside those tunnel networks and safe, like we would be, in the London Underground if London was being bombed. They choose not to let them in. But also, this crucial thing, they could stop the war today. They could stop the war right now by releasing the hostages and saying, we will no longer have as our entire point of our existence the destruction of Israel and the annihilation of the Jewish people. That would be a good start in a negotiation, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, of course, they could have stopped the war in the beginning by not starting it on October the 7th, but then, like you say, they
didn't start on October the 7th, Jake. That's the answer to that.
Unfortunately, it didn't. It started with jihadism way beyond then. But, they could have handed the hostages back a lot sooner. They could do that today. The war would be over. And in fact, I reported in the Sunday Telegraph yesterday about how Israel is winning the war by sending its soldiers to fight Hamas in the tunnels underground. Terrifying for those young men. Yeah. One of the advantages of that is that there are no civilians there because Hamas didn't expect the IDF to go underground. So put the civilians above ground so they would get killed, not them. Now the IDF is going underground and saving civilians in the process at great danger to their own soldiers.
It is an extraordinary war. I mean, we are heading, aren't we, very rapidly towards the year-long anniversary with no real end in sight right now. Jake Wallis, I always appreciate you joining us, editor of the Jewish Chronicle, just back from Gaza there. Just to Ashford, just one aspect of this. The key thing about the BBC is not just an important, media organisation in the UK, it dominates the media in the UK and the news agenda. They are huge around the world and seen as a trusted organisation. So it really matters how the BBC reports this war.
Absolutely. And we saw with the march in London at the weekend happened, you saw people wearing T-shirts with the Hamas red triangle on it.
Yeah.
And suddenly we have... And suddenly we have people who feel that they can act with such impunity, and it filters down. So you need to start with your trusted news organisation being very clear that Hamas is a terrorist organisation.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have that message...
That's a statement of fact. It's not a matter of opinion.
If you don't have that, what happens is it filters down, and suddenly you end up in this whataboutery where is Hamas actually a freedom-fighting organisation? Yeah. Is Hamas actually, did the war start before October the 7th? And you end up in this situation where there's somehow some sort of justification for what they did.
Oh no, I mean that's literally what they almost claim, as far as I can tell from the broadcasts I listen to and what have the misfortune to listen to and watch. Theo Westwood, thank you very much for that.